Hello everyone, Poohead189 here, and we're going to kick off this series on the Battle of Thermopylae, setting up a few things you'll need to understand. Mostly, we'll be talking about what led to the battle itself, but throughout it I'm going to give you guys a crash course in Persian, Greek, and Spartan culture, so you don't come into the next episode with misconceptions. Firstly, I think everyone with a solid grip in reality knows that the Persians were not an evil people. In fact, Herodotus tells us that they were well regarded by the Greeks in terms of virtues and that they were known for their honesty. Of course, the Greeks still regarded them as barbarians, but to the Greeks, barbarian simply meant foreigner, or someone who didn't follow the Greek polis or city-state. Now, before you get into who was right and who was wrong, in accordance to the Greco-Persian Wars, let me explain to you the main points people tend to bring up. One of the biggest points is slavery. How slaves were used back in the beginning of the classical era, and who did and didn't have slaves. This is a overly complicated topic. It's not so cut and dry that you could point out who had slaves. The Greeks had it's poor wording to call it a healthy slave trade, but it was healthy for the economy, which means it was at least large enough to be notable. However, they weren't state slaves. They were bought and owned by private citizens. Persia, on the other side of the coin, didn't really have a large slave trade. There were certain provinces in Persia that sold slaves, like Babylon, but Persia itself did not have a large slave market. Generally, the closest thing to slaves in Persia, other than, the few provinces that did have slaves, were war captives and some indentured servants, but usually they were treated exceptionally well compared to the rest of the world. Many people exiled from their homelands found open arms in Persia. In fact, a Spartan king did, named Demaratus, and I'll talk to you more about Demaratus in the next video. However, while that sounds nice, a lot of pro-Persian scholars tend to overlook a certain fact. Despite Greek citizens sometimes owning what we would consider slaves, the Greeks, and even many modern people, would consider every citizen of the Persian Empire a sort of slave. Namely, because they lived under what we would know as a dictatorship. People were often treated well and were allowed to trade freely, but if the Persian king so chose, he could execute any one of them without trial. And sometimes, Persian kings did. Persian kings were known to shoot the messenger, as it were, at least reputedly. Bring them bad news and they might just have your head cut off. This went for the lower barons and satraps as well. The Persian people had to live under the whims and wishes of the aristocracy, which to us and the Greeks would be a very unwelcoming prospect. To the Greeks, every Persian citizen was a slave to the king, and so they considered Persia a despotic slave state, no matter how noble the people could be. There's a reason the Greeks were so well regarded in Western culture. They were the first people on Earth to create what we would call a government of the people. As I said earlier, you were a barbarian if you didn't live within a city-state that had a constitution, with inalienable rights for every citizen. To the Greeks, that is what made them Greek, along with their language and religion. It wasn't the land that they lived in, but how they lived. The Greeks considered people living in Italy, Persia, and even within Celtic Europe Greeks, because these people lived under a Greek polis, where people could vote in an assembly. Hell, even the Greek city-states that lived under aristocracies had more rights than people in Persia. So it wasn't exactly black and white in who was more moral, or who had or didn't have slaves. The Greeks bought and sold slaves, but they looked down on Persians in a sense because to them, every one of them was a slave to the king. It really depended on your point of view. Now, let's also get this over with and talk about slavery in Sparta. Historians, beginning from the 17th century all the way to the modern era, have had a decidedly anti-Spartan bias, mostly because they believe that Athens should have won the Peloponnesian War, and while no one would argue that Athens has many virtues, it also had more than enough flaws. But this isn't a video about Athenians, it's about Peloponnesians and the Persians. Back to Sparta. A lot of historians would have you believe Sparta was a backwards slave state, with 7 slaves per Spartan, a deeply flawed society, a cruel training system, and also that a lot of Spartans were gay pedophiles. And yeah, I'm not kidding. But I'm here to inform you that all of that is horseshit. There's no evidence to support any of this except through small anecdotes from people who were not Spartans. In fact, most primary sources were Athenian, meaning we need to rely on archaeology, certain tangential evidence, and the writings of people who didn't make speculations. Further evidence of the fact that these are speculations is because Spartans themselves helped spread the image that they were a strange and backwards people, so their opponents would underestimate them. Athens is known for its intelligence compared to Spartans because the Lacedaemonians, or Spartans, spoke little, laconically, hence Lacedaemonian, and didn't wish for others to know just how clever they were. One notable example is when an Athenian came to Sparta, and every Spartan he met was eating what we might call gruel, just some disgusting slop, and the Athenian marveled that the Spartans could survive on such a meal, while the Spartans never really commented on it. When the Athenian left, you can guess that the Spartans didn't continue to eat the gruel. The Spartans were militaristic, religious, and in some ways archaic in their government structure, but they were also a city-state that most other Greek city-states aspired to, because every man, woman, and child was ready to serve, fight, and die for their city-state. No retreat, no surrender. As for the slaves, I'll tell you why the 7 slaves to 1 Spartan citizen is a misleading number, namely for 2 reasons. The first reason is that in Greek society, women had many rights, but voting in the assembly was usually not one of them. Not because they were considered inferior, but because citizens were expected to go to war for their city-state, and you could only vote if you were a soldier. Ergo, a Spartan citizen was technically just a Spartan adult male. So you could already multiply Spartan society by 4 times, considering there's also adult women, male children, and female children. The second reason the Spartans weren't so outnumbered by their slaves was another huge class of citizens that most scholars neglect to mention. They were the perioiki, or the perioikoi, which in Greek meant free men. Perioikoi were people who were not slaves, but they weren't citizens either. They couldn't vote, for instance. However, they did have a relatively decent amount of rights, and in exchange for being able to farm off Spartan land and to be protected by Spartans, they needed to serve the city-state as auxiliary soldiers. There were about as many perioikoi as there were Spartans, maybe even a little bit more, so now those 7-to-1 odds trying to make Sparta seem like a vast slave society is looking pretty misleading. Now that we know the defenders and a bit about the attackers, let's start talking about how the Persians came to try and conquer Greece. You see, as I explained earlier, there were some Greek city-states in the western shores of Turkey under the rule of the Persians. They were called the Ionians. Around the year 499 BC, the city of Miletus first, and then the rest of the Ionian city-states rebelled in what today is called the Ionian Revolt. The Persians had treated them well, but the Greeks have always had a difficult time being ruled by a foreign power, and wanted their independence. These Ionian Greeks called the Greeks on the mainland for help. Athens, who was actually a mother city-state to many of these cities, along with a few like-minded city-states, responded with supplies and weapons. After a few key battles, in 493 BC, 6 years later, the Ionian revolt was crushed and they were brought back under Persian control. Now I'm going to be skimming past a lot of details to give you a broad overview, because this is the video leading up to Thermopylae, but needless to say, King Darius of Persia did not like that these Greek bumpkins had the audacity to aid people who he saw were rightfully under his control. He sent an invasion force to teach the Greeks a lesson. There were some notable battles like the siege of Eretria, but it all came to a head at the Battle of Marathon. The Athenians, whose democracy had only been in place for about 20 years by this point, wasn't really considered the powerhouse of a city-state that it would later become. The Persians, a sizable fleet, were stationed on the beach of Marathon, where the Athenians and a small force of Greeks from the city-state of Plataea had them pinned down on the beach. It was a little bit less than 11,000 Greeks, 10,000 of them being Athenian. But the Persian force was far larger, and the Athenians were waiting for the Spartans to come and help them. Only this was during a Spartan religious festival, something they weren't going to halt, the Spartans, and so the Athenians waited there for a week until they saw the Persians packing up their ships to leave. On that morning, the Athenians decided to attack while the Persians were busy. All 10,700 troops got up and ran at a dead run for an entire mile, wearing 60 pounds of protective gear, armor and shields together, taking the Persians completely by surprise on the beach. It was a stunning victory. The Athenians cut down what Persians they could and forced them to flee. Philippides, or Pheidippides, depends who you ask. I think Philippides is the modernized version and Pheidippides is probably his ancient Greek name, then made the famous marathon run from the beach of Marathon to Athens. 26 miles before he entered the city gates, cried victory, which was Nike, or Nike, like the shoe, and then collapsed and died. So if you think about it, the normal marathon run isn't 26 miles. It's running a mile in full hoplite armor, fighting a pitched battle with a Persian rearguard, and then running 26 miles. Either way, the Athenian troops made it back to Athens to defend the city, as the Persian fleet, what was left of it, had tried to go back and see if they could score a victory on Athens when its troops weren't there. But they were there when the fleet arrived, and so ended the first invasion of Greece in utter defeat in 490 BC. Needless to say, King Darius could not let this stand, mostly because if these Greeks, who were considered frontier hicks, could fight off his armies, it would make more important and wealthy subjects rebel, like Babylonians and Egyptians, because remember, Persia was the largest empire in the world at this point, other than perhaps China, but I'm pretty certain Persia was larger. Well, the Babylonians and the Egyptians did rebel. Within the next 10 years, the Persians quelled these rebellions, and King Darius actually passed away. It was left to his son Xerxes to finish what his father started, and so he began the next invasion of Greece. This time, his army was far, far larger than the one before. Herodotus tells us it was over 5 million troops, but modern historians believe it was about 250,000. Though, that army was likely still larger than any 3 Greek city-states down to the last man, woman, and child, so it was a huge force. It was essentially a moving megacity. Now, you might ask at this point, why Sparta got mixed into all this, because I've been talking about Athenians and Ionians. Well, Sparta was actually the hegemon of Greece, and by that I mean Sparta was the leading city-state, for lack of a better word. It was kind of the leader. Sparta was the city-state with the most lesser city-states under its rule, or under its influence, and it had the strongest military, and it was also the one the other city-states aspired to be like. So when there's an invasion of all of Greece, the Spartans would be the ones that the others would look to for support. Well, the Persians sent emissaries to every major city-state, asking for earth and water, which was tokens of submission. Most city-states accepted this, actually. So a lot of Greece, didn't think that they could defeat the Persians. A few denied it. The Spartans and the Athenians did something far different. The Athenians put the emissaries on trial and executed them, and repeatedly they threw them down a gorge, but I'm not sure if that's true. Because the Athenians knew that the Persians would never treat them fairly again after they aided the Ionian cities and defeating them at Marathon, even if they submitted. The Spartans, on the other hand, were not about to be ruled by another, and they threw the emissaries down a well. You remember in the movie 300 when Leonidas kicks them down that hole? It was pretty much that. It was throwing them down the well. And the Spartans told the emissaries that if they wanted earth and water, they could dig for it. Now, the first invasion of Greece didn't reach Sparta, but the second was, as I said, far more serious of a threat to the entirety of Greece. The Spartans and the Athenians, and those who would stand with them, needed to make a stand. The Spartans wanted Athens to evacuate their city-state and flee to the Peloponnese, and obviously the Athenians were not very keen on abandoning their homes, so they cut a deal. Themistocles, who was leading the Athenian assembly, met Leonidas and discussed terms. The Athenians would allow the Spartans to command the Greek forces on both land and sea, because even they admitted the Spartans were in charge. But the Spartans would need to try and help protect Attica, which is the area where the Athenians and a lot of their sister city-states lived, and it's also pretty much the eastern half of Greece. And so it was that in 480 BC, fully 10 years after the first invasion, did Sparta gather 4,000 to 7,000 Greeks, depending on who you believe, along with 300 of their own citizens and their king Leonidas, to go and defend the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Leonidas himself, in a show of good faith to his allies, and in order to fulfill a prophecy an oracle made in which a Spartan king needed to die in order to save their city, went with them. And so it began, 2,500 years ago on this very day, September 8th. Stay tuned for my next video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. See you.